important and timely session, informed by the think piece, which you will have received already. It comes on the back of our conference last week about leading the future, and conference which we will be repeating annually, we hope. The series of think pieces are designed to provoke reflection, challenge, assumptions, and stimulate dialogue. So a forum like this gives us the opportunity to engage in conversation and thinking, and particularly to engage in conversation with the paper's author. So it's really important that you feel you can play a part in this session by putting as many questions in the chat facility as you like, and we can then see where the conversation takes us. We're going to be dependent on your questions later on in this session. I do need to give you a couple of housekeeping points, which are, please don't try and share your screen. We'll throw gremlins into the thing. And please keep yourself on mute. You can have your camera on or off, it's up to you. So the topic for today, well, we face profound challenges in society and education, and the challenges are global as well as local, with different countries and systems responding differently. Educational leaders everywhere, though, are hungry for thought leadership, which helps them to navigate uncharted waters and provide a response which meets the complex, disparate, vast challenges that the world faces. It's marvellous to have someone here today who brings such substantial experience from across the globe and who distills her engagement and research into writing, which both provokes and excites our thinking. Valerie Hannon works with people and organisations who are at the forefront of facing up to what the future challenges might be and using them as creative opportunities to design futures-oriented learning. She's a global thought leader, inspiring systems to rethink what success will look like in the 21st century and think about the implications for education. She's the co-founder of the Innovation Unit, and she's a radical voice for change, although she is very firmly rooted in a deep understanding of how education systems work currently. She's had a distinguished career in education, and she now works independently to support change programs across the world. She's advised governments, worked with systems and schools on every continent, and she's working with some of the most challenged as well as the most innovative leaders in education. She advised the OECD on its Education 2030 project, and she's now working with its High Performing Systems for Human Flourishing program. She's a regular keynote speaker, facilitator at international conferences and workshops, where she draws on her substantial research and publications. Her best-selling book, which I am going to give a plug to because it's very, very good indeed, Thrive, has been extremely influential. Valerie was the Australian Learning Lecturer for 2020 on the subject of the future school. The resulting book, Future School, is published by Routledge, and the think piece we are exploring today was drawn from the work on that book.
Or by camera by accident.
In 2021, she received the EduFuturists Award for outstanding.
Okay, can we switch the headsets? I take normal ones and you take these ones.
Is somebody able to just mute themselves? They're talking about a headset. So if they're able to mute themselves, that would be great. Finally, I should say that in 2021, Valerie received the EduFuturists Award for outstanding achievement in education. So it's a real privilege to have you here, Valerie. I'm delighted also to welcome your two discussants that we have to respond to your paper. First is David. Hello, David. David Godfrey is an associate professor in education, leadership and management at UCL Institute of Education in London and the academic programs leader in the Centre for Educational Leadership. Previously, he was co-director of the Centre for Educational Evaluation and accountability, and he was a lead inspector for the Independent Schools Inspectorate. David is an advocate of research-informed practice in education. His projects and publications include research-engaged schools, school peer review, inspection systems, and lesson study. And I know many of our audience today will have been influenced by some of the work that I've just listed. And our second discussant, hello Peter, is Peter Kent. Peter was a secondary head teacher for 23 years. During that time, he worked closely with the National College for School Leadership, and he also served as the president of the Association of School and College Leaders. He was a member of the Ethical Leadership Commission, and in 2022 became president of the International Confederation of Principals. He's an honorary professor of practice at UCL Centre for Educational Leadership. So welcome to both of you as the discussants. I feel that you are really well placed to offer some responses to develop the arguments and develop the conversation with Valerie. But first of all, it's a very big pleasure to welcome the author of this think piece, Valerie Hannon, who I think, Valerie, you are going to give us something of an introduction to the piece and how it came into being, as well as some of the key ideas.
I am Jane, and thank you so much for that kind and generous introduction. As you say, I'm going to give a shortish presentation, although people will have had access to the think piece. I'm going to kind of not assume that, give an overview of the big ideas, and encourage people who are interested in taking it further to have a look at the think piece and what underpins it. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you to UCL for showing an interest in this work and engaging with it. I appreciate that. I want to thank particularly Louise Stoll, who made the connection, not just for the connection, but for also for her incredibly generous reading of early stages of the book and really wise editorial suggestions. So thank you, Louise. I also happen to know that she has COVID, so I'm hoping that she's starting to feel better. One other preliminary, which is that the title is The Future School. And I am acutely aware that schools are nested within systems. And my brief, I'll explain the brief in a moment, was the institution of school. I think there's a huge piece, and indeed I'm doing a fair amount of work on it, about future systems and their characteristics and how they need to change in order to enable future schools to emerge. But that wasn't the brief. And so I'm not going to be going there today. And if that frustrates you, I'm sorry, but we are looking at the institution of school. And I'm not unhappy about that in the sense that it gives me an opportunity to affirm my real belief in schools as an incredibly important social institution. For all the critique I'm going to offer, I'm no de-schooler. And I think that schools are an incredibly important social institution, one of the few left actually, where young citizens can come together, meet people face to face outside their family, and encounter diverse and perhaps challenging points of view. We need schools very badly, but I think we need them to be redesigned. So that takes me to the brief and how I got into all of this. And I'm now going to utter the dreaded words, which is I'm going to share my screen. There we go. In 2020, I got asked by an Australian foundation to be the Australian Learning Lecturer for 2022. So a biennial event, and they bring people from all over the world to come and talk about issues of international and particularly national interest. And the task they gave me was Future School, which I accepted with alacrity, researched it, wrote it, and then of course it didn't happen. COVID had other ideas. So the lecture didn't happen, but the book did. And that's what you're looking at here, how schools around the world are applying learning design principles for a new era. A snappy title, I know, but that's where we went. It was a joy to write. I want to thank my colleague researcher, the brilliant Julie Temperley, who worked with me on this, tracking down schools, and writing profiles of them. And although the short think piece is pretty thin on that, you will find all of those within the book if you should choose to go there. So that was the brief. And where did it come from? It arose, get this to move, from this perception that, as Jane started to suggest at the beginning of the event, we are in the age of hyperchange and disruption. And for all that we would prefer and like to live in an age of steady improvement and increasing prosperity and peace and calm, we don't. Rather, we live in the age of hyperchange, incredibly speedy, penetrative, and in some instances, profoundly disruptive. I hardly think I need to spell that out. But one way of thinking about it is to imagine these or see these as change forces, which will impact upon our children's lives, even if not upon ours. And you can see them listed there. I don't need to read them all out. They, I think, are indisputable in terms of the impact that they will have on young children's lives 20 or 30 years from now, some immediately affecting them right now. Not least what we are seeing, I think, is the convergence of the climate crisis with biodiversity loss and the impact upon our health. So the interrelationships are subtle and not so subtle. So in the face of these change forces, what do we see? One thing is an interesting international response. And in the September of last year, for the very first time, there was convened at the United Nations an international summit called Transforming Education. Not, notice, improving it or reforming it, but transforming it. And I quote for you there the words of the Secretary General in opening the conference, who said, "The crisis in education," notice the term crisis, "requires us to fundamentally rethink its purpose and its curricula. In a world of rising tensions, fraying trust, and existential environmental crises, education must help us not only live better with each other, but also with nature." So that was the first of the Transforming Education Summits. And some people are starting to see it actually as the first of our COPs. We have COPs for climate, too many of them perhaps, and too inconsequential up until now. But there are those who see the education crisis in just those terms. And internationally, nations are convened to take a look at it. What's the background understanding? Well, the background understanding is that we are alive at the most decisive moment in the history of humanity, facing challenges, as I've just suggested, some of them existential. Schooling systems are currently entirely inadequate for addressing the scale of those challenges, because learners are not acquiring the knowledge, the skills, and the values needed for this 21st century era. Some of them, anyway, can pass exams, but are they learning how they will thrive? So the question put to me was, what do schools look like that are addressing the challenges head on? And this presented a methodological quandary. And to the researchers out there, I wonder how you would have gone about addressing the issue of schools fit for the future. It's not as if we can work from evidence backwards. So what sort of task is this? Is it one of advocacy, simply putting out there a strong argument for the kind of things that ought to arise? Or prediction, usually a mug's game as far as the future is concerned? Well, I decided to start somewhere else. I elected to start not with schools, but from the implications of the work of futures thinking. In other words, what do we know or think we know about the contours of the future itself? What is the future that we want? Any of you who are familiar with futures thinking will know that that's where it goes. It's not about prediction, it's not necessarily about advocacy, but it's asking the question, what is the future we want? And what trajectory do we need to take to bring it to being? So my starting point, as I say, was with organizations who were thinking about this issue, futures thinking organizations. And my method then was to say, okay, if that's what they are saying about all this, what do they say are the implications for education in schools? And I wasn't alone in doing that. A plethora of recent reports has been looking into exactly those questions. So I'm kind of not making this stuff up altogether. A particularly interesting one, if you don't know it already, is the UNESCO report, Reimagining Our Futures Together. Note the subtitle, A New Social Contract for Education. I think it's a brilliant thought, and it's a really, really interesting report, which takes the change forces that I've just set out to you as the backcloth to project forward. So our research scan looked at 23 future-focused organisations. They range from think tanks, international think tanks, to challenge prizes like Chan Zuckerberg or the Yudan Prize or the XQ Institute, to also Indigenous organisations. We looked at the First Peoples Principles of Learning in Canada. If you don't know it, Knowledge Works, the last one I've mentioned there, is a particularly interesting think and do tank, which deals in the whole issue of the future, creates future forecasts. So we did a scan of these. And what we then synthesized from them was what they saw to be the implications for schools. And what was very interesting was that they usually framed the implications in terms of design principles. I thought when I'd started this that we would use the usual frameworks or categories of curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment, but not so. They came in on the issue of design principles. And if you're wondering what does that mean, design principles are fundamentally laws with leeway. And when we got into this and started researching what was going on, it was interesting that even in the really rather constrained system that obtains in England, we came across extraordinary, wonderful schools, innovative schools, who are quite explicitly and intentionally using design principles to guide what they do and determine the nature of the organisation. And I would cite within that School 21 here in London. I'd cite XP School up in Doncaster doing brilliant work. And if you don't know the video that Madeline Holt did recently about them called The XP Story, Above All Compassion, do take a look at it. And I'd want to cite the Gesher School here in London too, designed particularly to address the needs of kids with neurodiversity. Not that we're not all neurodiverse, but specifically. All of them intentionally, explicitly using design principles. So working not from schools, but from those think tanks and futures thinking organizations, we noticed that they could be synthesized into three categories. There were design principles around values, design principles around operational philosophy, and a set, and that's the ones I'm going to dwell on today, of design principles around the learner experience. So let me flip through these at quite a clip, because you'll have the paper, you can read them up, but I do want to give a sense of where they go. There were 5 design principles which focused on values. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, some of them are pretty self-explanatory, but there was a design principle around being purpose-driven, in the sense that the schools ought to have in mind individual and collective flourishing, or thriving, if you like, and the derivation of personal purpose for their learners. So this issue about purpose being fundamental to their value frame. Equity focused, you may say, don't schools take that for granted? They certainly do not. And in this one, the design principle really means addressing social injustice wherever it's to be found. And such schools who are really thinking hard about that design principle would, for example, take the whole issue of Andrew Tate straight on, and the issue of misogyny widespread in our society and within schools too. So it's a wide frame, a wide focus for what equity focus might mean. Strength-based, a really, really interesting one, I think. So noting that we're not all about the cognitive, take School 21, it's head, heart, and hand. And the issue is to identify and determine and build on the strengths of every individual. So that was the set of design principles around values. The next cluster was a set of design principles around operational philosophy. And one I want to draw your attention to is being learning focused. And you may say, well, that's pretty damned obvious for any school. Of course, it isn't. Too many schools are just focused on what they've always done. and doing the conventional thing. Well, schools fit for the future need to be thinking and learning about how powerful learning happens. So you talked earlier, Jane, about being research engaged, research informed. Schools in this category will be reading Todd Rose, they'll be reading Linda Darling-Hammond, they will be alert to what's coming out of the neurosciences in terms of learning. That's their core business, not transferring great chunks of facts and knowledge from, say, the geography syllabus or whatever. It's about being learning focused. Flexible dynamics, a really interesting one. We saw it in schools through COVID, but let me give you an example now, a very contemporary one. How are schools responding to ChatGPT? They've got a choice. They can ban it or try, or they can think flexibly and dynamically about how it might be used and critiqued. They will understand that every knowledge job in the future will be aided or assisted by artificial intelligence, and think about the consequences of that. A term you might have come across, ecosystemic. In a nutshell, it means that schools need to be base camps for learning and not cages. And I want to dwell a bit longer on the final cluster, which is around the learner experience. And here we found 5 design principles. So starting with one which I think most educators would be have been thinking about for the last decade, really, being personalized. What does it mean? It means that the learner's experience should relate to her personal needs, passions, developments, and purposes. These are at the center. It's not the institution, it's not the teacher, and it's not external bodies of knowledge. Now, that's not to say that there are no curricula, of course not. Of course, there are the foundational competencies that young people need to acquire in order to release their learning. But it means that the learner's experience and their passions and needs are taken into account and put at the center of how they take this forward, especially in the later years in the secondary. Second design principle is around being integrated. The learner experiences meaning through learning that transcends silos. It builds connections within and between disciplines. So this isn't throwing out subjects, it's about utilizing many forms, disciplinary for sure, but interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary. Thirdly, inclusive. The culture is experienced as respectful and welcoming. Everybody who rocks up is respected for who they are, their heritage, whatever their past learning or experience. And that is so fundamental, as is the next one. And this, of course, is really a fundamental finding of the last couple of decades, that good relationships are the basis for deep learning. Individuals are known, they're known as people, and collaboration is the norm. And then finally, we talk now a great deal more about agency, but future schools should build and leverage learner agency, or self-direction if you prefer it, providing opportunities for learners to take increasing responsibility as they age and ownership over their own learning. Again, that's not about complete autonomy. Again, that is in the context of a system which has expectations. I know we're going to talk about assessment later, but we'll get there. But nevertheless, in this country, as in many others across the world, the issue of how learners experience what they're going through, especially in secondary, as increasingly empowering, is critical if we're going to build the future we want. So out of that, we built a database. We looked at those design principles, and here, again, pay tribute to the work of Julie Temperley in helping me with this. We went after schools who were instantiating these principles. And you will find in the book really interesting examples of what they're up to. But we also noticed that they kind of cluster. The design principles are ingredients. They're not a recipe. And that's up to schools. And schools are combining the design principles to address the major challenges of our time. So we've had a short study of those, and we've called them archetypes. And we found that there were 6 of them. By archetype, we meant a kind of a model or a pattern, if you like. And here, I want to stress again that there's no suggestion that all schools should conform to these archetypes. I put them before you because it's what we found, and I think you might find them interesting. Nor is there any suggestion that any school is about one thing, just one thing. Plainly, that's absolutely absurd. It's not the case. But here are the 6 archetypes that we found. Growing ethical leadership, building our technological future, promoting environmental thriving, experts in career navigation, growing entrepreneurs and change makers, and the one which I absolutely had not expected and was completely surprised by, focusing on our human identity. Let me very quickly give you some examples of what these look like. The first one, archetypes that we found, is around growing ethical leadership. And this group of schools, found a lot of them in the US, but also internationally as well, take the view that across the world, we face a real deficit of ethical leadership, and that we need badly in the world today leadership which is not based on entitlement or wealth or gender, but rather on an ethical framework and capabilities and competence to undertake it. So the school we focused on most of all was the Liger Leadership Academy, which is in Cambodia, in a country racked, of course, by a disastrous civil war, badly in need of new leadership. If you look on the Australian Learning Lectures website, you will find video material with the principal of the school, and I would have shown you some of that today, but we haven't got time. And they are spreading across the world. They've just opened up a new campus in New Zealand. And their approach to selecting design principles, for the ones I've set out for you, are all focused on how do we grow great leaders for creating the future we want. The second archetype is predicated on the view that our whole future is dependent on the kind of technologies that we are building. And one example of that is the Kozen group of schools in Japan, supported by the National Institute of Technology. And their kind of assumption is that what we need is young people who aren't just consumers of technology, but rather who are confident creators of it, moreover, confident creators within an ethical framework. And that's what they set out to do. The third archetype is promoting environmental thriving. And here, the foundational principle is pretty simple, really. Their view is that unless we grow young people who are in a fundamentally different relationship with nature, our species has had it. And their selection of design principles is all committed to enabling young people to become environmental champions, to lead in that area, but also to shift their own relationship with the environment. This is the fancy new campus of the Green School in New Zealand. It didn't exist when I wrote the book. There was only one at that stage in Indonesia, but now they're spreading, and they're in Indonesia, this one in New Zealand, in Mexico, and in South Africa. And of course, in this country, we have green schools who particularly are focused on that, but this is the overarching mission for this group of schools, and they're explicitly selecting design principles to help them fulfill their mission. The next of the archetypes is about being experts in career navigation. Now, that may not light your fire, but one of the disruptive things we notice that's happening in our societies and our communities is a transformed world of work, a transformed landscape of employment or non-employment, indeed. The whole relationship with work and the nature of work is changing fundamentally. And this is a group of schools across the world who are thinking that actually the best thing they can enable young people to do is to become expert in career navigation, recognizing that they won't just have one job, they'll have 17 or 20, or become freelance and have portfolio careers. And they might work in 3 or 4 or 5 fields, indeed in a field that has not yet been invented or discovered. So how do you enable young people to become confident and navigate their way through that kind of environment easily? Well, one case, a school that I spent a week at, is the Met, part of the big picture group of schools. This one is in Rhode Island. It's the kind of archetype that politicians like quite a lot, and I've cited Barack Obama on this one. We'll follow the example of places like the Met Centre in Rhode Island that give students the individual attention while also preparing them through real-world, hands-on training, the possibility of succeeding in a career. It fits with the dominant paradigm. That's not a criticism. I think it's a really important archetype. And when I was there, by the way, it was an extraordinarily inspiring experience. The kids were utterly engaged in what they were doing, extraordinarily smart about describing and articulating the personal purpose that they were evolving for themselves, which depended fundamentally on internships, which were spread out across the community. The next archetype is around growing entrepreneurs and change makers. And this group of schools, a lot of them in India, very many in Canada as well, are committed to saying, actually, we need change makers. We need young people who've got the confidence and the skills and the competencies to go out in the world and make change. Entrepreneurs who might be financial entrepreneurs, but might be social entrepreneurs too. And there are skills and competencies and mindsets that enable that to happen. The school that we focused on, and again, I've spent time with them, a profound experience actually, is Learn Life, which is in Barcelona. And you can see the motto is put on the back of his sweatshirt, talking to these young people about the evolution of their personal purpose and how they were pursuing personalized programs to achieve those aims was quite fantastic. Some of them went on to higher education. Some of them took on different routes. Some of them founded businesses or social enterprises pretty early in their lives. And then the final one, which surprised me, archetypes of finding our human identity. And this is an extraordinary set of schools, really. Again, quite a few in the US, where in the context of obviously a history of slavery, of racism, there are schools who are focused on enabling young people to, in the deepest and most profound sense, find out, determine who they are. The school I spent time with and interviewed was this school in New Zealand, E Tapua, and led by an extraordinary principal, a Maori immersion school. And as she describes it, she says, the Maori come from a broken place. Our young people cannot be effective learners until they understand and reimagine their place in New Zealand society. So our focus is on our human identity. And of course, that's true in now particularly as we see the rise of AI and asking ourselves, what is special about humans? What is it going to be about the human species that distinguishes us and that gives us a future? So there were the 6 archetypes I found. I stress again, they're not intended to be some kind of pattern for others to follow, but it is interesting to me that schools who were selecting design principles in this kind of way also saw themselves as attacking the major challenges of our time. So I'm going to finish there, but I will just say one more thing, because I'm quite certain that there will be people out there saying, well, that's fine. What the hell do we do about it as individual schools? And I think that there are perhaps 3 things that individual schools can do. The first is to begin the conversation as a staff, with parents, as communities. What do we now believe needs to be our purpose? And join in the national debate, even here in England. You know, we've got some fantastic organizations now really trying to address this issue. And I'd particularly urge people, if you haven't already, to look at and join up with organizations like Schools of Tomorrow, or Big Change, or Big Education, or Rethinking Assessment in particular, and Whole Education. All of these tribes, if you like, of like-thinking organizations who are trying to think forward about how we need to shift and become a community of practice. The second thing within your schools, I think, that can be done is to identify where is the energy to innovate. maybe select one of the design principles, maybe build from existing strengths or attacks and weaknesses. So schools I'm working with across the country are doing this because you can do it in bite-sized chunks. You don't think you need to go for a complete revolution. Create maybe a sliver of people, an innovation team to inquire and prototype. Build on professional learning communities, something that the Institute has championed for some years. And finally, we need to be creating the evidence base. We need to be creating the stories, the videos, as I've mentioned, the XP School in Doncaster have done, but also data over time about outcomes, as long as these are not just on the old metrics. So that is my overview. Thank you so much for listening. I'd love to hear from people. And that's my
Okay.
Someone's microphone is on, Jane, so you might.
I know, I'm just about to say it, Valerie.
Okay, so I'll stop sharing there, and thank you so much for your attention.
And thank you so much, Valerie. So much substance and so much to think about in 35 minutes. Extraordinary. Well, 25 minutes, really, 25 minutes. Before I turn to our discussants, let me just say how this works, people. We need you to put questions into the chat function. We have a few now, and we've got a couple of interesting ones. And we've also got a link to the XP Schools video that Valerie referenced very early on in her presentation there. But we want to see some more questions from you so that we can start really chewing over the substance, both the principles and possibly practicalities of what it is that Valerie's said. So get your questions into the chat. And I'm going to start by asking David to speak and give his response. And then I'm going to turn straight to Peter and ask for his response before I go back to Valerie and ask for her thoughts on what's been said. And then we're going to go to the Q&A. So you've got time, as you're listening to David and Peter, to construct your own thought and question. David.
Thank you very much, Jane, and I'm delighted to be invited to respond and build on the wonderful presentation and think piece that Valerie has written to really provoke such a wide array of thinking on this topic. Valerie sets out the very important question, what future do we want? And I think that's a really nice way of looking at this kind of future thinking. So often these are sorts of questions that are not explicitly considered. They're taken as a given. So it's a very wide-ranging piece, and I won't try to respond to everything. I'll pick up on a few things which resonated with me. I was in 2006. I was in a job interview in a London school, and I was trying to convince them to take me on as a deputy head teacher. And one of the it was one of these kind of grueling, in fact, it was a 2-day interview. I got to day 2 and I was having lunch with the governors of the school. And the question I had was, David, what do you think the future will be like in 10 years' time? And for schooling, that is. And I said, honestly, I think it will be almost exactly the same as it is now. With a little bit more technology, perhaps, not fundamentally different. Bums on seats and a teacher at the front, and some form of engaging students in that type of learning. I think I've been proven right in that. Nevertheless, of course, the developments are coming thick and fast in things like AI. Valerie mentioned ChatGPT. I've come to learn there is now a rival Bard, which Google are developing as well. And you'll have seen many recent headlines, including the one that ChatGPT pass some law exams for top universities, passing the entrance exams. These kinds of developments are in some ways maybe frightening, strange, unusual developments, but ones with both possibly negative, but also we need to think about the positive roles of these in education as well. The other thing that I think that is often forgotten about, that was really highlighted again during and after COVID, was the important custodial role that schools play. And, you know, on a very basic point, parents go to work and they need a place for their kids to be looked after. I mean, not that the schools are just babysitting institutions, but the custodial role is one of the roles of schools that is depended upon. So I think this is quite rightly highlighted in the article, and embracing the point about how this space and these spaces of schools can actually be repurposed imaginatively in the future. We also know that staff have in many ways missed the human contact they had during that COVID period when they were working in isolation. I was working on a evaluation of a very large project involving around 400 schools, the Schools Partnership Programme. It was funded by the Education Endowment Foundation. And one of the things we found is that although this fantastic partnership set up during COVID an alternative methodology for engaging in the programme online, very few people really took up that offer. Much of what happened in that programme was essentially about old-fashioned social learning. It was going to the institution, having the professional conversations, seeing practice happening live, and sharing and understanding that these school leaders shared common problems, and some had the answers, some had better answers than others, but that was really powerful, I think. One thing that resonated with me in the article was about design principles. I really like that idea. Purpose-driven, equity-focused, promoting identity, relevant. These are things that Valerie brought up in this think piece. One of the ones I'd like to just pick up on is about strength-based. The school must build from each and every individual's existing assets. As a father of 2 children, I, like other parents, I think we have a good idea of the strengths of our children. Maybe we overlook their weaknesses, but also their potential. So often, however, in schools, there are tick boxes in which, for very good intentions, teachers are forced to focus on children's weaknesses and how they must improve them. Rather than flipping that and thinking, well, what are their strengths and what are their potential and how can those really be developed? I remember having a conversation. I think this was the first parents' evening I ever went to. My daughter was 3, she was in the nursery, and the teacher had only 10 minutes, and she went through the early years targets, and that took up about 9 minutes of the meeting. And she met all of them, fortunately, apart from the one about using scissors. And at the end of this, I said to the teacher, well, I won't name, but I said to the teacher, so everything's fine then. She's happy, I hope, and she's settled in well. And she said, well, she needs to work on the scissors. Fortunately now she's 14, she can operate scissors quite well. The other thing I liked about this operational philosophy, the idea of schools being ecosystemic, it's something I've also written about. This idea, Bronfenbrenner talked about the macro, exo, meso and microsystems surrounding children. You can apply that to schools as well, and everything that's needed in an ecosystem to enable professionals to be research informed. But the term also has a deeper meaning. We are now in the human epoch, sometimes called the Anthropocene. It's one in which the fate of the environment is in our hands, its destruction and ours, or the opposite, thriving, nurturing for a growing population, 10.4 billion by the end of the century. Surely this Anthropocene has profound implications for future schooling, not least because, as Anders Schinkel has noted, before we can look at how schools can provide the solution to the climate crisis, we should first reflect on the role they've played in leading us to where we are now. So a word of caution too about sometimes the potential for wonderful initiatives to become about accreditation and tick boxing, green school movements and so on and so forth. Of course, I don't want to detract from the excellent work that many of these schools are doing. But my word of caution is to become aware of welcoming a series of tack-on initiatives that don't fundamentally change a paradigm. So, so piecemeal efforts, even at curricular change, may not be enough. And the other thing is, we talk about children being the solution to the present climate crisis, but adults need to be involved too, and need to be involved now, otherwise it's too late. We're talking about meeting the IPCC target limits of 1.5, that's looking unlikely, degrees above pre-industrial levels, at least 2 degrees. It looks like unless everyone's involved in that effort, including adults, then that's extremely unlikely. So what kind of future will our children have in 20, 30 years' time? So those are just, there's so much to talk about in the article. I'll leave you just with those few thoughts now, and I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And just a reminder, everybody, I'm going to go to Peter Kent now, and then Valerie will have made some notes on the very interesting, thought-provoking, scissor-laden contribution that David made, and we'll do a response. I see we have got some very interesting questions which are helpfully grouping themselves thematically, which is really good, but we welcome non-thematic questions as well, so don't forget the chat. Peter.
Jane, thanks very much, and Valerie, thank you so much for what I thought was a really powerful presentation today, following on from what I found was a wonderful think piece. And I was reflecting as I read it that so often as a serving head teacher, one's thoughts are dominated by the day-to-day pressures and responding to the latest government initiative. And it was so refreshing to have the opportunity to think beyond the day-to-day and to have one's thoughts liberated by the issues that you touched on in your think piece and where you've taken us further with today. And I just wanted to share fairly briefly a few of the places that my thoughts went to in response to your think piece, and I'd be really interested to hear your further comments about them. And I suppose it is very much the response of someone who's led a school for a long time, because the first place my thoughts went to was around the issue of accountability. And I know, Valerie, that you mentioned that you're doing further work in this area, and that was not the area that this paper was directly addressing. But it would be interesting to hear your sort of further reflections on it. Jane, you mentioned at the start the very successful conference that we had in CL last week, Leading the Future. And we had a panel to finish the conference. And one of the first questions we were asked was, what would education look like without the involvement of the state? And all four of us on the panel concluded but we didn't think that would ever happen. We didn't think there would ever come about a situation where the state wasn't involved in education, not least because it invests so much in it. There's literally billions of pounds invested in education. So given that, where do we think in the future schools accountability would be focused, given that it's going to need to have a role? And what would it look like? I, along with many, many others, with a very recent experience in schools would not want it to look anything like the UK's current high-stakes system, which needs a lot of change and a lot of learning. But if futures thinking based design principles are going to enter the mainstream and are going to enter state-funded education, which was one of the points you made in your paper that needed to happen, one of the areas for development, then we need to think through what accountability might look like. And I suppose as part of this, one of the reflections I had was schools have changed to a certain extent, as you said, and as David's reminded us, over time, but some elements haven't changed. There's a certain core of learning and skills that perhaps society sees as being important and significant, and but unlock future opportunity and future potential. When Mick Waters wrote an introduction to the national curriculum, he described it as the learning that the nation has decided to set before it's young. And so be interested just to hear your reflections on whether in our search for future schools, we need to make sure that that core of learning is not neglected. Do we need to still have an accountability for certain core elements that we think really matter, regardless of context or situation or design? And that even in the future school, there are some elements of the past in terms of that core learning that continue to really deeply matter. A second thought, which I'd be really interested to hear your further reflections on, is you talked about the challenge of predicting the future, and that's exactly what you weren't doing in your paper. But there is, I think, a challenge sometimes for the future school, and even the future school based on design principles, but it doesn't base itself on priorities that could perhaps be seen as transitory or passing. As I think you pointed out, education hasn't always been great at anticipating the future and anticipating what will come further down the line. How might views, for example, about democratization or what makes an effective entrepreneur shift over time? Are the danger that one might teach schools in technology that then become out of date because of changes or new innovations that overtake them? And of course, there are also different understandings around the world of what technology is. And since I've taken on my role with the International Confederation of Principals, I've been very aware of that. We recently had a meeting about new technologies in schools, and one of my colleagues from Africa said that his school had recently introduced a major piece of new technology. And we thought that he was saying that they had just brought in some computers to the school. And what he went on to say was, we brought in a major piece of new technology. We've installed running water so that all of our pupils are able to wash their hands before they eat at lunchtime. So technology can mean different things in different contexts. And that's part of what we need to take account of. Your paper refers to, your think piece refers to the fast changing world of work and employment. And I suppose that's one of the challenges that future schools present, almost being keeping up with this fast changing world that is around us. But I think that takes us back to the real strength of your approach, Valerie, and the real strength, I think, of the think piece that you mentioned at the end. I love the fact that schools in different parts of the world and also in different contexts in the UK can take ideas and approaches and strategies that interest them, and as you suggest, try them out. When we recently brought together school leaders from around the world, one of the bits of feedback that struck me afterwards was one of my colleagues from Australia wrote, "We've got so much to learn from one another." And that was my feeling after reading the think piece and hearing you speak again today, Valerie. It's fascinating to hear about so many fresh, provocative and creative responses to the future, and wonderful for us all now to have the chance to apply them in our own way to our own situations and contexts. So Valerie, thank you once again.
And so thank you very much, Peter, and plenty there. I mean, there was plenty there to have a whole conversation about just in response to your presentation, Valerie. But I'm going to let you respond before we turn to, we've got loads of questions coming in now, some really interesting ones. So,
thank you both, Peter and David. Actually, I'm going to start, Peter, with your last point and kind of work backwards. And I've got 4 points I want to pick up from David, and I think 2 big ones from Peter. But where I'm going to start, actually, is that last point you made there, Peter, because I had the privilege to spend some time in not all of these schools. Some of this research happened during COVID, so it was when writing the book, so it was too problematic. But I did spend time in others. And I'll tell you this, and it's absolutely true. I found myself privately in tears about afterwards, because they were so moving to be in, to see kids, you know, passionately engaged in their learning in ways that you can only pray for. And it can happen. The world doesn't have to be like this. The UCL's own professor, Jeff Mulgan, has just published a book called, what's it called? It's a paean in praise of political and social imagination. And he entitles it, "The World Could Be Different, the world could be otherwise." And we have got locked into thinking this is how the world has to be. This is how schools have to be. It ain't true. And when you go into a place where they have really taken through into practice principles which are completely related to a moral framework and a moral set of values, it blows you away. So I'm just going to say that before, and you know, I'd have my grandchildren go there in a heartbeat if I only could. So having got that out of the way, let me go to 4 points from David. First of all, I just want to say, you know, these are not my design principles. I haven't said, oh yes, I think it would be this, this, and the other. I researched them from really powerful organizations who are thinking about contours of the future, using different kinds of models, some of them using trend data analysis. I mean, I won't go into the tools of futures thinking. And then working from that to say, the lodestar, the motif must be the future we want. Now, of course, that isn't the same, coming to your point, I think, about context there, both of you actually, but Peter in particular. If you are living in a totalitarian state, or if you are living in a place which is utterly now polarized, there will be different conceptions about what kind of future they want. So this is not a morally neutral exercise. This is infused with values. And you have to face that up front and say, that is the case. So I have absolutely selected organizations who were completely explicit about that value frame and derived their implications for schools from that. So those are the design principles. And I would perhaps have put in a few others, but as I say, they weren't mine. I just used them. The strengths-based one, I think, David, is really, really interesting. And it hadn't particularly struck me, but you know, since then, but most of you will have read Todd Rose's work around the end of average. And it is a powerful indictment, really, of the alternative approach, which does, as you say, not consider the jagged profiles of every human, you know, different strengths, different weaknesses, and find a way to enable and empower young people through recognizing those. Read Todd Rose if you want to take it further. The point about ecosystems, I want to make clear that I use the expression schools as base camps, not as cages. So yes, certainly it can be interpreted in the way you took it, David, but the ecosystemic approach really is fundamentally about saying, and this relates to one of the teachers, so one of the questions in the chat about teachers' competencies and teachers' skills. It's about teachers being choreographers of learning and thinking to themselves, I can't do everything within this classroom, but I can identify all kinds of interesting sources, sequestered assets, if you like, in the community, whether it's my local community or my global community, that I can bring both to the classroom and have kids go outside and learn in different places and localities. That's what's meant by ecosystems, and it needs work. So the Met School, the one I mentioned in Rhode Island, they can only run their internship program by being profoundly ecosystemic. But I think they identified something like over 500 organizations that they can send their kids to on internships and liaise with, and make sure that the learning that goes on isn't superficial work experience, but relates to the curriculum when they get back in school. That's an ecosystemic approach. And just the final point that you made, Peter, this is not about piecemeal add-ons to the curriculum. This is about paradigm shift. It is fundamental. And I say that in the full knowledge that in the constrained circumstance of the English system, we can only hope to be working towards nibbling at the edges and getting to the heart of it through, I think, design principles that any school could take on a handful of, or one or two, and move in that direction. But it's not about adding the odd module on, you know, saving energy, or, I mean, not that that's a bad thing, but it's not worried what we're talking about. So accountability, right, the big one. And I see there is a question in the...
Yeah, we've got a couple.
From Ron Glatter. I'll kick off on that, and then maybe people will be dissatisfied with my answer and want to come back. Let me start off by saying that I believe it is impossible for states to be excluded from the business of determining what education should be about, nor should they be excluded. I think it is about an expression of our democracy, and surely the education system is in part a vehicle in which we transmit the values of what we as a society are about. So if we are interested in defending, or preferably redesigning and reinventing democracy, then the schools have to be the grounding for where that happens. But of course, you're completely right that the investment in the schooling system means that states will never withdraw. I would argue, nor should they. Now, the question is, what should their role be? Should it be getting down into micromanaging? The best systems, of course, do nothing of the kind, but they set high-level goals about how they see the education system furthering their objectives of society. And in my view, the best of those talk very fundamentally about equity and redesigning equity. So I'm just about to publish in March, I hope you might read it, a book called The Politics of Education Transformation, in which I discuss the whole issue of politics in particular. And when we talk about the system, we might mean the political dimensions of that, or we might mean the professional one, the DFE, Ofsted, all of those organizations, you could say of command and control, and what their role ought to be. I believe in accountability. I do. I think it's really, really important. I've lived throughout an era when there was insufficient accountability, and we don't want to go there again. The question is, how does it become what our good old friend David Miliband calls intelligent accountability? Well, a lot depends upon the indicators that you use. And it is not difficult at all to think about the kinds of indicators which are more attuned to furthering realization of the future that we want. So for sure, both of you remarked, are these kids attaining foundational competencies and literacies? A series of literacies, you know, the usual ones, but there are a couple of others that you might want to chuck in as well, because that empowers them to address and access the rest of a very broad curriculum. Point one, essential. But what else? What about the levels of mental health in the school? Are kids resorting to counsellors or chemicals to enable them to get through? What are the levels of anxiety and stress or breakdown? Is it a place which is, as it were, mentally healthy and leading to a sense of well-being? You can say indicators for that, and some schools are really, really poor at it, and I don't think that we should leave that out of the accountability frame. Should we think about an indicator about engagement with the community? To what extent does this institution, this place, contribute to its local community? And in what senses does it do that? So for me, it's about the indicators and making them broad enough and relevant enough and intelligently assessed And that brings us into the whole field of assessment, which I'll come to. Well, actually, I'll say it now. If ChatGPT doesn't drive a coach and horses through our assessment system, I don't know what does. And, you know, either it leads you to thinking that we can reimagine what assessment should look like, particularly around assessing performance, or we just tighten the screws on the existing system, which is a really pathetic response, I think. Just staying with your final points, Peter, before I hand over to our participant audience. The guiding motif must be the future we want. And of course, that is contextual, but then that we should debate it is really, really important. Let us debate that. Let it be part of the entirety of the curriculum. So I've been lucky enough to be involved last year in New Zealand, where the new education minister under Jacinda Ardern, and he is now about to be the Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, convened a series of summits around the country saying to people, what do we want education to do for us? What is it for? And particularly brought Maori voices into that, and of course, particularly young people. I'm going to South Australia later in the year, where again, the new Director General is doing exactly the same. He's convening all the leaders of education in the state of South Australia to say, what do we want out of our system? What is our purpose? What is the future we want? So debate it, and it may well be highly contextual, and for me, that's absolutely fine, because I think the diversity of these responses is really important. I'm going to stop there. There's an awful lot more, but as you have noticed, I can talk about this forever. So let's go on to the audience.
Well, the good thing is, Valerie, you have actually attended to a number of questions, sort of one way or another, in what you've just said. But I'm going to take us back to the curriculum thing, because we had a few kind of linked questions there. Rupert Hyam was talking about the need to transform both curriculum and assessment. You've talked about assessment. How should they change, and what are the most powerful ways to leverage the change? And Chris Taylor was saying, well, given the curriculum constraints, what can catalyze movement forward? Adrian Lyons said, given the hugely narrow and backward-looking DFE and Ofsted obsession with a knowledge-rich curriculum, how can state schools adapt their curriculum? And indeed, given the disincentives, why would they want to? So if we're starting with the point where we want some agency in schools, as well as systems, and schools with agency thinking about purpose and what they want, what can they do given the constraints they might feel under now?
Loads, absolutely loads. So the first thing I would say on the assessment piece is, if a school on this call is not yet a member of Rethinking Assessment, do it now. Join up, get involved in that debate, read the critiques. They're devastating. I mean, you read any of the papers by, say, Professor Bill Lucas, Peter Hyman, who's a member of that organisation. I mean, and a number of people on this call. I mean, a number of people on this call are better equipped than me to talk about it. But we now at least have a bilateral, non-political organisation which is pointing out that our assessment system is, to say it's not fit for purpose is polite. You know, it's bloody criminal, in my view, what it's doing to young people. It's not serving any part of society. It's not serving business. It's not serving universities. The universities think it might be, but we might go there. There's a whole issue around the universities' influence on all of this. So I would say, first off, join Rethinking Assessment, have a look at the critiques, and have a look at some of the alternatives. The good news is that around the world, this is one of the areas of fantastic innovation. So you look at, in the States now, the most elite schools, the Ivy League schools in the US, are all now getting into the Mastery Transcripts Consortium. Look it up, Mastery Transcripts Consortium, which gives a much more rounded view of what a young person can do and know. I'll come on to knowledge in a minute. In Australia, there's the New Metrics project being run out at the University of Melbourne, looking in part at profiles, but also looking at the way in which new AI techniques can be incorporated to enable a far better rounded assessment system. And of course, it always comes back to purpose. If you think that assessment is just about filtering and selecting and accountability, well, to be honest, you're not much of an educator, because you need to understand assessment is about liberating learning and empowering the learner. So the best work on this, of course, is about, from Lorna Earle in Canada, and indeed Louise Stoll has been involved in this. How do you create assessment systems that are for learning and as learning? And of course, they have other purposes as well. So I would say, join Rethinking Assessment, get part of a pilot around profiles. If you look on the website, you'll find that Rosie Clayton is working with Bill Lucas, who identified schools who want to think about how to assess differently. And I think of a school like XP up in Doncaster. You know, they put into place so many of these design principles in the existing system. It's a state school, and they're up front with their kids, and they'll say, look, we are going to have a really, really rich program of learning. You are going to be empowered by this. And by the way, when we get to around about 16, you've got to do these damn things called GCSEs, and we'll hunker down and we'll go through the motions, we'll get you through it, but that's not the real deal. So, you know, while we're stuck with GCSEs before we abolish them, which I hope will be within my lifetime, there's some aspects of this that we have to go along with, but it doesn't put a stop to all the kinds of progress that we can make. On curriculum, the best thing I ever read on curriculum, and I really urge you to read it if you haven't seen it, is Larry Rosenstock, the founder principal of High Tech High, who wrote a paper with his colleagues called Changing the Subject. And it just completely reframed the way I understood curriculum, because we have in our heads this kind of restricted notion of curriculum as this body of facts and chunks and performance bits that you have to master and regurgitate in a 3-hour exam. And Larry really completely reframes curriculum as a flow of experience and a set of choices. And when you read that, I think you understand how curriculum could, as indeed the archetypes of the schools in my study did precisely. So they saw curriculums as being fundamentally related to purpose and to enabling. I mean, how much do you remember, you know, even of your first year university degree? Most of us have completely forgotten the lot. But the point is, did you acquire the competencies that made you a really powerful learner and motivated to pursue fundamental areas of study that you then were really capable and powerful within? I mean, this for me is the issue. And if we can succeed in ensuring that young people are not turned off learning, that they understand that they can be powerful learners in different ways, whether that's in practical senses, not necessarily all around the cognitive, then we will have done our work, I think, towards moving in the direction of enabling them to shape the future that they want. I'm sure I've missed many other points that you made of importance, but I feel I ought to shut up and let some of the other voices come in.
Okay, well, thank you. I was going to ask about the curriculum, and actually, Peter, you might want to come in on some of these points about curriculum and assessment. Don't feel. Can
I just say one more point, Jane? I remember an interview I gave with I'd had, very fortunately, with the leaders of XP School, who said, for us, you know, there is no aspect of the national curriculum that can't be taught through the lens of ensuring that we have environmental thriving. No aspect of the national curriculum that you can't do. You name a bit. And if you take a lens of environmental thriving, you can do it. And that's what they've chosen to do. So you can sort of pick those off. I come back to do you remember the design principle integrated on the operational philosophy? So they make an integrated, meaningful piece. And by the way, they happen also to be ticking off bits of the national curriculum, which, by the way, is in my view, a bit too over-egged. But that is not to say that the notion of being knowledge rich is useless. No, I mean, who's not in favour of knowledge? And it's one of these absurd, you know, false dichotomies. Of course we're in favour of knowledge. It's a question of how much you are kind of mandate to be so-called acquired, in other words, regurgitated in an exam, short term. So
I saw David nodding quite vigorously when you were talking about integrated. curriculum and the opportunity to work through the lens of other things to get to the curriculum. So David, again, you might want to come back in a minute, but just before, oh, do you want to come in now, David?
Well, it speaks a little bit to the point I was making earlier about the human thriving as a goal for a school. It's something that's a kind of integrated principle. These are not tack-on initiatives. Where you see it not working is when the actions of the schools don't speak to the values of the school. So you see, for example, let's have kind of Green Day, where the one day a year that the parents don't drive and drop their kids off at school, for example, even though the intake of the school is far and wide, which means most of the time they actually do have to drive anyway. So, you know, where the principles and policies don't match. We see this with schools adopting growth mindset and then putting kids into ability groupings. So they say, we do Carol Dweck's growth mindset. Well, what do you mean by we do it? Well, what does that mean? It certainly doesn't help that you give students the impression that their abilities are rather fixed and therefore they should be grouped according to attainment. So that's one thing. The other thing, I mean, one of the things that England is quite innovative about is school-to-school peer review. And I think here lies something quite powerful, just the principle of peer review and the point that Peter was making about there's so much knowledge within the system. The OECD have written about how much more could be done for peer learning. And sometimes peer inquiry is a word which is perhaps more open and as less kind of resonating to, you know, of Ofsted and Moxted and things like that. I think so much can be learned. There are processes and structures which can enable spaces for learning between schools, and some of it's about setting up the right kind of those sorts of values-based principles and processes that enable that kind of change. So I think that's part of the answer, but those are much more flexible and intelligent forms of accountability, sometimes tailored, where the criteria for success will be derived from the participants, not externally derived. So that's quite, I think that's really quite different to what many school systems have, where it's very fixed and rigid, and it's not really fit for purpose when we're thinking about the types of changes that we might require for a future school.
And if I could just follow on from what David and Valerie have been saying, Jane, in the days of yore when I used to do work with the National College, one of the areas that was very rich was around in-school variation. And one of the big things came out from there that there were pockets of excellent practice in almost every school. And one of the most powerful things in terms of curriculum innovation and assessment was sharing what was happening. I think there is more freedom, more flexibility than sometimes we realise. And the same principles as David's just mentioned apply about sharing both what's going on within schools and what's going on between schools, and enabling some of that creativity that's taking place, because I think things are less constrained than sometimes we feel because of those day-to-day pressures that I felt. And just one further reflection, I'm doing this call from Amsterdam, where I've been visiting a colleague who's leading one of the practical schools here, which again has a similar sort of structure of schools, but a slightly more free approach to accountability, but enables them to develop systems that enable students to pursue particular areas of skill and preparation for future life without bumping their head against accountability regimes and assessment regimes that hold them back.
Thank you. Thanks both. So I'm going to move swiftly on, because otherwise we're not doing honour to anything like enough of the questions we've had in. There was a very interesting one which you just reminded me of, actually, from Graham's iPad. I've got a feeling Graham's got a surname. I think it might be Hanscom, but it's Graham's iPad on there, which said, don't we really need a pincer movement for schools and policy at a sort of state level? And he posed the question of where the imaginative policymakers are going to come from. I'm going to not ask you to answer it straight away, Valerie, but just to relate it to one from James Mannion, who asked about the examples you've had from your experience of forward-thinking systems. And just hold that, because before that, I'd like us to think about if it's going to be school level change and schools are going to pick up the energy that there is, as you said in the presentation, and make changes for themselves, re-envisage their purpose, and therefore do some profound work. We're talking about really big changes for teachers and staff, and the real importance of capacity. And we had a couple of questions. Chris Taylor asked about what are the new competencies that teachers need to do this. You referred to facilitating learning earlier on. And Mark Nichols said, well, what about staff as learners? Do we, in the sorts of paradigms you're talking about, see staff as just further along a learning journey, and therefore the learner experience is as important for them as it is for the younger people? So something about staff learning that's going to build the energy and capacity for this.
I think it's a no-brainer, Jane, really. I can't imagine you would think I'd say anything other than, of course, they must be lifelong learners. They're in the knowledge business. And if you look at the really great systems around the world, they invest hugely in enabling teaching staff and leaders at all levels, classroom leadership, teacher leadership, distributed leadership, and the leaders of institutions, to be learning all the time, as was already remarked, sometimes through cross-school peer review and cross-school inquiry, and internationally as well, but also through their own research and through their own attempts at prototyping and innovation. That is a learning space. So on teachers, I think it's for me very much the heart of it, and I often feel that the example of teachers working in the early years and working in the not just nurseries, but in the earlier years of primary schools as well, manifest many of the kind of qualities and competencies that one would hope to see later on. Later on, people seem to think that they are about being a historian and transferring this amount of history knowledge into these modes of brains. Whereas, of course, in the early years, teachers don't conceive of themselves in that way, which is why increasingly people who come through that background are assuming leadership responsibilities because they have in my view, much more profound vision of the role of the educator. Now, what does that mean in terms of, having done a physics degree and being tasked to teach physics? Well, for me, the future lies in, firstly, recentering your focus, which is on these learners in front of you. And yes, all right, right now you've got some responsibilities, as we've said, around the assessment framework. But fundamentally, it seems to me, it's about designing learning experiences that enable them to think like scientists, to understand how they might pursue interests through scientific thinking, and find experiences, I would say, oftentimes through project-based learning, not exclusively. I don't think it's the silver bullet, the answer to every question, but I do think that teachers in our system, particularly, are not as well enabled through a mastery of project-based learning, which, again, I think is an extraordinarily powerful vehicle for making meaning, encouraging engagement, motivation, and depth understanding. So if I'd say one thing, just one, I would say, as a teacher in our schools, find the time to inquire into best practice in project-based learning and see if you could add it to your repertoire. And it will take you to new and surprising places, I think. So that would be that one. And of course, learning at many levels. The idea that you'd be a teacher and you're done and you're cooked and you stop learning, this is just a nonsense, isn't it? It's absolutely absurd. did you want to go back to the issue of accountability and smart systems or not?
Yeah, where you've had, because I think it's intriguing. Graham asked, where are these visionary policymakers going to come from?
Yeah.
And James asked about, have you got examples of systems that are following this forward-looking agenda, or a set of this forward-looking agenda?
So my recent work has been particularly triggered by going around and working with teachers who said, God, we want to do this, but the system won't let us. The damn system won't let us. And I'm thinking, well, what do we mean by the system? And of course, you've got at least to attend to two levels of it. One is the professional, the agencies who fulfill political mandate. So then there's the political level. And I became really intrigued by why it was that politicians really almost never articulate an alternative kind of paradigm for education. They're stuck in a 20th century story in the 21st century. By which I mean, they are still talking about the same old, same old. The indicators are what? Getting kids into university. Well, thanks a lot. That's useful for, that applies to 50% of the population. The rest don't matter. And what's it for? Always it's around the economy, which is not unimportant, but I've written about this in Thrive, obviously. I was really interested by where are the smart politicians or the courageous politicians? I see in the question the issue of courage comes up.
Yeah.
Who are prepared to say, actually, just like with climate, that's the old story, and we've got to start thinking differently about this now. And it's a big shift, but somebody's got to give the lead, and I'm prepared to. So I just spent the last 6 months interviewing or going into the political world, not my world, and asking politicians, you know that the education system isn't working for the future. Why aren't you talking about it? So we're publishing that paper in March. But I guess what I want to say about it in total, and it comes back to the point that's made in the question, it's a pincer.
Yes.
It's not about politicians being the visionary, here you go, folks, this is the way forward. They get a sense of what it is that movements and campaigns and generally public opinion is starting to shift, and then they will go there. But they are stuck in a very short-term mindset because they're up for re-election and there's only so much you can do and you're going to get eaten by the media. So where do we find, again, I come back to the analogy of climate. If you talk to the language of environmentalism 20 years ago, you just, as a politician, forget it. You mean we can't fly anymore? No, thanks. But now they understand that enough people care enough about a crisis that's enveloping us to start to articulate that in different ways. And I think, therefore, as parents, as grandparents, as educators, we have to start, so I studied what I said earlier about get into the conversation and get people talking about different purposes for education and build a movement which will in turn enable the politicians who get it to start offering some leadership. And it will seem then a little less courageous and a bit more doable. And that will be win-win.
Well, Valerie, thank you very, very much for that. I do need to give you a minute to sum up, but I think you've done a lot of that in this minute. Nicholas Garrido asked a question about which of the 6 archetypes most resonated with you, considering your research and your experience. If you want to make a reference to that in your closing 30 seconds, you please do. But before I hand to you for that, I do want to say an enormous thank you from all of us. We're getting lots of thanks on the chat for a really stimulating session. I think David and Peter, I'm sorry I didn't come to you more because you had so much you wanted to contribute and your contributions were fantastic. But Valerie, the think piece and this thought-provoking presentation has been one of the most stimulating pieces I've read for a long time and a most stimulating session. So last word to you, Valerie.
Well, thank everybody for hanging in at tea time, dinner time on a a cold February night. Appreciate it. Hope you found it of some value. And that's the point, really. It's for use. You know, it's not supposed to be some kind of clever framework that one can pick conceptual holes in. It's for use. And that's why I say, again, I think there's something about the design principle approach, which I say, it's not mine, you know, it's something I found out there, that you can use in a doable way, even in our constrained circumstances. So that's point one. Point two, make connection with some of the great schools I've name-checked today. They're doing, I mean, in the case of the Gesher School, for example, they're publishing a journal called The Bridge. And you can't do much better than clock into that and look at some of these design principles in practice, in action, in our system. And join your tribe, find your tribe. As I've said, there are some organizations now, I think, doing great work. We've got to build a movement around this. We've got to bring it in from the margins and get people to understand that so much depends upon this. Childhood is not a happy place to be right now, and it's going to get worse unless we step up. So, you know, get involved in the conversation, in movements who are trying to move in this direction. And thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, everyone. And glad you found it useful. I'm not surprised. Good night, or good day, or have a good time, whatever time it is where you are. Bye-bye.